The air in Black Creek, North Carolina, hung thick and damp, a characteristic blend of pine resin and the ever-present misty blue haze that gave the Smoky Mountains their name. It was a place of isolation, where the ridges swallowed radio signals and the dense forest floor was still unforgiving, a realm ruled less by state law and more by the hard, unwritten codes of its scattered inhabitants. The year was 1919, the Volstead Act, the start of Prohibition, was looming, and the community's already precarious economy was tightening like a hangman's knot, forcing many into the illicit but profitable trade of moonshining. In this climate of desperation and tight-lipped suspicion, a young idealistic lawman named Deputy Sheriff Elias Thorne, 24, had just arrived from Asheville. Elias was a clean-shaven man, his uniform crisp despite the humid morning, carrying a worn leather satchel instead of a rifle. He preferred facts to force. He was here to investigate a series of alarming, though unconfirmed, reports. Missing persons, specifically children, over the last 2 years, always brushed off by the local sheriff, an old mountain man named Jedediah Slate, as runaways or lost in the vast wilderness. Elias's contact was the local school teacher, Miss Clara Bell, a woman whose kind eyes belied a fierce, almost dangerous determination. He found her waiting near the old, white-steepled chapel, the only building in Black Creek that seemed determined to defy the surrounding decay. "Deputy Thorne," she greeted him, her voice low, the melody of the mountain dialect evident. "I appreciate you coming all this way. I didn't know who else to trust after Jedediah shut down every inquiry." Elias offered a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over the few wooden cabins visible through the mist. "Miss Bell, your letters were detailed. They spoke of more than just runaways." Clara clutched her satchel, her knuckles white. "They were not runaways, not the 3 boys nor the 2 girls. They vanished without a trace, and the common thread, Elias, it leads straight to the Latham family farm." The Latham farm. Even in Asheville, the name carried a certain chilling weight, a reputation not of menace but of unnerving isolation. They were old money by mountain standards, a family of recluses who had worked their patch of land for generations, almost entirely self-sufficient, avoiding all public life. Their house, a massive unpainted structure built generations ago, sat deep within a forgotten hollow, miles from the main dirt road. "Tell me about the Lathams," Elias prompted, pulling out a small notebook and pencil. "They are peculiar," Clara said, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "There's the father, Silas Latham, a man as cold and silent as the mountain rock. The mother, Ilara, rarely leaves the house. And then there are the whispers, the strange sounds at night that the neighbors claim to hear, sounds that aren't animal, not quite human. But the Lathams are powerful here. They own the mill, and nearly everyone owes them something or fears them." Elias knew the drill. Economic control was the bedrock of local power. And the children who went missing, were they connected to the Lathams in any way? Only by proximity and by a certain vulnerability, Clara admitted. They were all children from the poorer settlements, kids whose disappearance wouldn't set off the alarm bells in the city, kids everyone assumed were better off gone. She paused, chewing her lip. "Elias, I believe those children are still alive. I believe they are somewhere on that farm." The deputy felt a cold, professional dread settle in his stomach. Missing children were one thing. A deliberate, sustained confinement suggested a horror he'd hoped to avoid in his career. "I need a legal avenue, Miss Bell. A warrant requires proof or at least strong, reasonable suspicion." "I have something," Clara said, her eyes glinting. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, crudely drawn sketch on thick, yellowing paper. It depicted a dark space, 2 small, indistinct figures, and a heavy-looking chain attached to a wall. "This was given to me by Thomas, one of my former students, a boy who often delivered supplies to the Latham house before he moved away with his mother. He was terrified. He said he saw a hand reach out from a dark place in the basement." Elias took the drawing, his fingers tracing the shaky lines. The realism of the fear in the sketch was undeniable. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to justify a more aggressive approach than a simple inquiry. "The main house is too exposed," he murmured, his mind already calculating the logistics. The Latham place was a fortress of isolation. "We need to observe. We need to find the access point, the area Thomas described." Clara nodded, her fear morphing into resolve. "There's an old, overgrown logging trail behind the property. It leads to a dilapidated smokehouse on the north side. Silas rarely goes there." As the first rays of the sun struggled to pierce the fog, bathing the mountain peaks in a sickly grey-green light, Elias felt the oppressive weight of the hollow. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful, but watchful. He looked at Clara, a beacon of courage in this fearful community. He knew the investigation had to be surgical, quiet, and terrifyingly fast. They were alone here, pitted against a family woven into the fabric of the mountain itself. The fear that those missing children were down there, chained and waiting, sharpened his resolve into a dangerous edge. The whispers of Black Creek were about to become screams. The mystery is just beginning in the Great Smoky Mountains. What Elias Thorne finds next will shake the foundations of this isolated community. Make sure you don't miss a single chilling detail of this investigation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Elias Thorne spent the rest of the morning absorbing the geography and the palpable tension of Black Creek. He didn't interview locals, he observed. The town was small, a collection of ramshackle homes and a few essential businesses, the Latham mill, a general store, and the chapel. People moved with a subtle slump to their shoulders, their eyes habitually cast down, a classic sign of a community crushed under a quiet, pervasive fear. The impending prohibition added a layer of economic panic. Moonshining was a lifeline, and the Lathams, with their mill and their old money, held the ends of many of those lifelines. Disrupting them was more than an investigation. It was a threat to the community's fragile order. Clara Bell met Elias just after sunset. They rendezvoused at the northern edge of the creek, where the woods thickened into the truly wild, unforgiving Appalachia. The air was colder now, the fog heavier, muting all sound. The mills closed for the night, Clara whispered, her breath misting. She carried a heavy lantern, its light focused low to the ground. Silas and Elara are always inside by 8. They never leave the property after dark. "Good," Elias replied, checking his revolver, a professional formality, as he prayed he wouldn't need it. "Noise discipline is paramount. We are scouting the smokehouse, nothing more. We confirm the location, and we look for any physical evidence Thomas might have missed." They navigated the logging trail, a serpentine path choked with undergrowth and loose stones. The forest smelled of wet earth and decay, a perfect cover for secrets. Elias was acutely aware that in this isolation, any sound they made would carry, amplified by the heavy mountain air. He mentally logged every snap of a twig, every rustle of a nocturnal creature. After 40 minutes of arduous walking, Clara stopped, pointing through a gap in the trees. There, the smokehouse. It was a small, dilapidated timber structure, leaning precariously to the side, its chimney a crumbling stack of fieldstone. It sat roughly 50 yards from the main Latham house, a looming shadow-draped hulk that looked more like a mausoleum than a family home. No lights were visible in the main house, a disquieting stillness surrounding it. "The basement entrance won't be obvious," Elias muttered, adjusting his hat. "A simple cellar door could lead to anything but a hidden chamber. That requires ingenuity." They approached the smokehouse slowly, their movements deliberate. The wooden door was warped, secured only by a rusting iron latch. Inside, the air was thick with the long-faded scent of cured meat and soot. It was a single earthen-floor room, empty save for a few rotting shelves and a central pit where the fire had once burned. Elias held the lantern high, casting long, dancing shadows. He moved systematically, pressing on the walls, checking the floor. He focused on the periphery, the places where a farmer might conceal a cache of illegal liquor or something far worse. "Clara, come look here." He was pointing at the northeast corner. The fieldstone wall, typical of mountain construction, appeared slightly cleaner, the mortar lines too straight in one section, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet high. Clara approached cautiously, running her gloved hand over the stone. It's been re-mortared. Recently, or at least since the building truly fell into disuse. That stone is different. Elias knelt down, placing the lantern at the base. He pulled a small, thin probe from his satchel, a tool used to check wood rot, and slid it between the stones. He felt a slight give. It's a false section, he confirmed, his voice barely a breath. No mortar behind the stones. They're held in place by some kind of internal frame. And look at the floor. In front of the false wall, the earthen floor was oddly compacted, not with the spread-out wear of regular foot traffic, but with 2 small, distinct indentations, as if something heavy had been regularly pivoted or dragged across the spot. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic scent, not of smoke or iron, but something coppery, wafted up. Elias pressed his ear close to the section of stone. The silence was absolute. "We can't force it tonight," he said, pulling back. "Too much noise. We need to come back with tools during the day when the ambient noise from the mill or the wind can mask us." Clara gripped his arm, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. "Elias, if there is something behind there, we need a distraction. Silas Latham doesn't leave his property, not for anything." Elias looked at the immense dark mass of the main house. They were playing a dangerous game of stealth and patience. "I know someone in Asheville who can create a suitable problem for the mill, a minor mechanical failure that requires the owner's attention in town," Elias said. "But it will take 2 days to arrange and execute. Until then, we must be discreet. We leave no trace." As they carefully retreated down the logging trail, the fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on them. They were almost at the edge of the Latham property line when a sudden sickening sound broke the silence. It was a single, rhythmic clink, metallic, heavy. Both Elias and Clara froze instantly, sinking into the shadow of a large rhododendron bush. The sound came from the direction of the main house, not the smokehouse, but the main dwelling. It was quickly muffled, as if the person making the noise had immediately realized their mistake. But it was enough. Clink, a sound that spoke not of running water or shifting timber, but of iron against stone. Elias's blood ran cold. The sketch, the compaction, the metallic scent. It all coalesced into a single horrifying conviction. The children were not just confined. They were restrained. He looked at Clara, his face grim. "We have less time than I thought. We move up the timetable. Tomorrow we get the distraction. The day after we breach that wall, no matter what." The silence that followed the single metallic sound was the heaviest Elias had ever experienced, a pressure that felt like the entire weight of the mountain pressing down on their chests. They were no longer just investigating a suspicion. They were on the precipice of a rescue that could either expose a terrifying secret or cost them their lives. Elias gripped his satchel, feeling the reassuring weight of the small, crude drawing inside. The whispers had become a single damning sound. The next morning, under the guise of an official inspection tour related to the impending prohibition laws, Elias rode to Asheville. He used the long, uncomfortable journey not to rest, but to meticulously plan the deception. He contacted an old acquaintance, a mechanic and minor opportunist who owed Elias a significant favor, and laid out the requirements. A non-destructive but attention-grabbing accident at the Latham Mill's primary drive belt, timed for the following day at precisely noon. Silas Latham was known to be obsessive about the mill's function. Such a breakdown would drag him into town for parts and repairs, a process that would take hours. Returning to Black Creek before nightfall, Elias met Clara at a pre-arranged spot, an old spring house several miles from the Latham property. "The distraction is set for tomorrow, noon," Elias reported, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Silas Latham will be called away. That gives us a 2-hour window, maybe less, to get in and get out." Clara nodded, her face pale, the stress etching lines around her mouth. I spent the day discreetly gathering supplies, 3 kerosene lamps, the small shovel, a crowbar, the heavy kind, and rope, just in case. Good. Tonight, we do a reconnaissance, a final confirmation of their schedule, and the immediate area around the smokehouse. Elias stated, "We need to know where Ilara Latham is at all times. She is the wild card." The second night was even more unnerving than the first. Elias and Clara positioned themselves near the logging trail, hidden beneath a stand of ancient, twisted oaks. The main Latham house was still a black shape against the slightly less black sky, utterly silent. For 3 agonizing hours, Elias watched through a pair of battered field glasses. He charted every movement. Silas, a tall, gaunt figure, briefly emerged with a lantern, secured a barn door, and vanished back inside. Ilara, the mother, remained a phantom. Then, at precisely 10:47 p.m., a single oil lamp flickered to life in a window on the ground floor of the main house. It was a small window, barely visible at the back, near where Elias estimated the main foundation met the earth. "The basement access," Elias murmured, adjusting the focus. The light stayed on for 15 minutes. Elias could barely make out a figure, Ilara, he assumed, moving within. She appeared to be doing something low to the ground, a slow, methodical task. There was no sound, only the faint, flickering glow. The light vanished. Darkness returned. She was down there. Clara breathed, her voice shaking slightly. "She visits them, to feed them, to look at them. We don't know, but the rhythm is established," Elias said, though the rhythm offered little comfort. It confirmed a routine, which meant they were dealing with a structured, long-term pattern of confinement, not a sudden, impulsive act. This suggested premeditation and a terrifying psychological detachment. Elias looked at the stars, obscured by the mountain mist. The weight of the children's suffering, their isolation, their probable terror, was becoming a physical burden. He had to compartmentalize the horror to focus on the plan. "The crowbar will be the loudest part," Elias said, mapping out the next day. "Clara, when Silas drives off, you position yourself near the mill road. You are our early warning. If he returns early, you ride fast and fire that pistol you carried twice into the air. That's our abort signal." Clara nodded firmly, clutching the strap of the satchel containing the tools. "And the children, Elias? How will we move them?" "One at a time. Through the smokehouse, down the trail, and into the waiting wagon I left disguised near the spring house. We move them under blankets, in the dark. They will be fragile, disoriented. We will need absolute silence and speed." They maintained their watch until 3 a.m., confirming the total silence of the property. The cold crept into Elias's bones, but the chill was secondary to the anticipation. Tomorrow was the day. The day they either found 5 chained children, or the day their investigation ended, buried quietly in the Appalachian soil by the Lathams. As they slipped away from the oaks, Elias glanced back at the dark, silent house. He felt the pure, cold evil emanating from it. The kind of evil that was purely human, born of twisted psychology and the absolute power of isolation. He had to believe in the strength of his own resolve, and in Clara's fierce loyalty, because in this part of the world, justice was not guaranteed. It had to be taken. The following day, a sense of heavy inevitability settled over Black Creek. The air was close, promising rain which Elias secretly hoped for. Rain would muffle sound. At 11:58 a.m., a loud, grinding metallic screech echoed from the direction of the Latham mill. It was followed by the frantic shouting of one of the mill hands. The distraction had begun. Elias, already positioned in the woods near the property line, watched as the main house door opened. Silas Latham emerged, looking enraged, his tall frame cloaked in a heavy, dark coat. He didn't even glance toward the forest. He jumped into his battered pickup truck, a rare luxury in the mountains, and sped down the dirt road toward town. At 12:05 p.m., Clara, positioned further down the road, gave the all-clear signal. a single low whistle that barely carried through the dense air. Elias sprinted toward the smokehouse. He moved with the honed efficiency of a man running on pure adrenaline. He reached the dilapidated structure and quickly checked the perimeter of the main house. No sign of Ilara. He assumed she was inside, carrying on her unsettling routine, perhaps confident in her husband's quick return. Inside the smokehouse, Elias knelt by the false wall. He began to work, his movements precise and controlled. He used the crowbar to gently pry away the field stones. The internal frame, a simple heavy wooden box, groaned, but held. He paused every few seconds, listening for any shift in the house's silence. After 5 minutes, the stones were removed, revealing a dark aperture. It wasn't a formal door, but a heavy wooden panel, hinged on the left and secured by a thick, rusted iron slide bolt on the inside, and a removable vertical beam on the outside. The beam was cleverly disguised to look like part of the smokehouse support. Elias removed the beam. He had to gain entry silently. He couldn't risk the noise of forcing the inner bolt. He pressed his ear to the cold wood. He held his breath. A sound, faint but unmistakable, reached him, a low, rhythmic thud. Thud, thud, like something soft hitting a floor. Not a cry, not a moan, but a dull, desperate cadence. He found the single weakness, a small knothole near the top right of the panel, perfectly positioned to be covered by the thick frame. He used a drill bit, a silent hand-cranked device, to carefully widen the hole just enough to slip a length of thick wire through. The bolt was old, rusted. It took another agonizing minute of careful probing and twisting until he felt the internal mechanism click. Click. Elias pulled the wire out, gently slid the panel open on its heavy hinges. The darkness inside was absolute, the air that rushed out a terrifying mix of stagnant moisture, human waste, and something else. A heavy, metallic scent that confirmed his worst fears. He raised the kerosene lamp, shielding the wick with his body, and stepped into the cramped subterranean space. It was not a basement. It was a shallow, excavated cellar, no more than 6 feet high, with a damp, uneven earth floor. The space was tiny, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, and it was entirely dominated by 5 small cast-iron rings bolted directly into the stone foundation of the house. Chained to these rings were 5 figures. They were children, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 13, clad in thin, filthy rags, their skin unnaturally pale, almost luminous in the lamplight. Their eyes, wide and dull, reflected the light like those of trapped animals. They were malnourished, and their limbs were shackled by short lengths of chain to the iron rings, allowing them only a few feet of movement. The rhythmic thudding he'd heard was the oldest boy, perhaps 12, rocking back and forth, his forehead hitting the cold stone wall, a repetitive motion of self-soothing and despair. Elias lowered the lamp, his heart hammering against his ribs, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated horror. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a holding cell. It was a tomb. The youngest child, a girl of 5 or 6, watched him with an unsettling, vacant stare, making no sound. The years of isolation had stripped them of the energy to cry out. "My name is Elias Thorne," he whispered, forcing his voice to be gentle, non-threatening. "I'm here to help you. I'm going to get you out." The oldest boy stopped rocking, his eyes, though weary and dark, fixed on the lawman. A flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe confusion, crossed his face. The clock was ticking. Elias grabbed the heavy chain cutters from his satchel. The true race against the return of Silas Latham had just begun. He had to break the chains, gain the trust of these silent, psychologically broken children, and move them through the dense woods without being seen. He had less than 2 hours. Elias Thorne forced himself to ignore the stench and the physical horror of the cellar. He had to be a tool of rescue, not a witness to tragedy. He moved to the oldest boy first, figuring the boy's cooperation would be the key to reassuring the others. The boy, whose skin was taut over his bones, watched Elias with an intensity that belied his physical weakness. Elias knelt down, his hand resting on the boy's cold, thin shoulder. "I need you to be silent, son," Elias instructed, keeping his voice a low, steady rumble. "Can you do that? Can you help me get the others out without a sound?" The boy nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. His eyes darted to the chain wrapped around his ankle, then back to Elias. It was a clear, non-verbal plea for freedom. Elias positioned the heavy chain cutters. The first cut was a violent crunch that echoed deafeningly in the small space, despite his attempt to muffle it against the stone. The boy flinched but held his silence. Elias cut the second shackle. The boy was free. He didn't jump up or run. He simply collapsed forward, his body too weak, his joints stiff from years of immobility. "Stay with me. Crawl to the panel. Wait there," Elias commanded softly. Moving with mechanical speed, Elias repeated the process on the remaining 4 children. The metallic crunch of the cutters was a terrifying metronome against the ticking clock of Silas Latham's return. Each child reacted differently. A silent tear slid down the cheek of the young girl, a low whimper escaped the lips of a younger boy, and a third child simply stared at the shackle now lying uselessly on the dirt floor, as if unable to comprehend its freedom. The third child he freed, a girl of about 10, was too weak to even crawl. Elias had to scoop her up, she weighed barely more than a pillow, and place her near the open panel door. Once the 5 children were free, huddled near the exit, Elias took a final sweeping look around the basement. He was searching for anything that would definitively link the Lathams to the crime. There was a small bucket of stale, hard cornmeal and a rusty pitcher for water. Near the iron rings, scratched into the cold stone, were crude drawings. Stick figures, birds, a sun. A heartbreaking testament to the children's long, lonely wait. He took a few photographs with the camera he'd brought, a quick, almost silent process, ensuring the evidence was preserved. He was about to climb out when he noticed something almost completely hidden beneath a pile of rotting straw in the corner. It was a single, child-sized shoe. It wasn't a common, cheap boot like the ones the local poor wore. It was a leather shoe, well-made, with a small brass buckle. It did not belong to any of the 5 children he'd just freed. Elias knelt, heart sinking. 5 children were reported missing over 2 years. He had found 5. But the shoe... He quickly examined the small, confined space. No other chains, no other signs of life or long-term confinement. He pocketed the shoe. The investigation was not over, even as the rescue began. He climbed out of the basement and quietly secured the panel door and the outer beam, making the smokehouse look undisturbed. The children followed, moving like ghosts in the late afternoon light, their eyes blinking painfully against the sudden, shocking brightness of the outside world. "Clara is waiting," Elias whispered to the oldest boy, putting a supportive arm around his back. "We walk slowly. We stay close to the ground. We make no sound." The walk through the woods was the most stressful part of the operation. The children's movements were clumsy, their weak bodies tripping on roots and stones. Elias had to carry the youngest girl. He and the oldest boy, who was showing remarkable resilience, guided the others. Every rustle of leaves, every distant chirp of a bird made Elias's nerves jump. They reached the old spring house, where Clara was waiting, her face etched with terror and relief. The wagon, covered with a tarpaulin, was waiting. Clara gasped when she saw the children. The reality was far more horrific than the letters and the sketch had suggested. She moved immediately, a natural maternal instinct overriding her fear, gathering the children under the blankets in the wagon bed. "I heard a vehicle turn onto the main road, Elias," Clara reported, her voice tight. "Not Silas, but it's unusual. We have minutes, not an hour." Elias's jaw clenched. Someone else was coming to Black Creek. Perhaps a moonshine delivery or a business associate of Latham's. He couldn't risk the wagon leaving now. "Clara, you take the children and hide them deep in the brush near the creek bed. I need to make sure the Latham house remains quiet." If that vehicle is coming here, I need to intercept it or misdirect it. Clara nodded, her eyes fierce. Be careful, Elias. You've done the impossible. Don't lose it now. Elias watched her pull the wagon into the deep, dark shadows of the forest. He turned and began to sprint, not back toward the smokehouse, but toward the mill road, praying the incoming vehicle wasn't Silas Latham returning early and that the children, now free, could survive the terror of their silent escape. Elias moved with a desperate, lung-burning pace, reaching the main dirt road just as the unmistakable sound of an approaching automobile, a loud, sputtering engine, grew louder. He flattened himself behind a thicket of mountain laurel, his breath ragged. The vehicle that pulled into view was a black, expensive-looking sedan, entirely out of place in this isolated mountain community. It wasn't Silas Latham. The driver was a man in a crisp suit and fedora, a figure that screamed city or business. He parked the car directly in front of the Latham house. A second man, stockier and older, emerged from the passenger seat carrying a hefty leather briefcase. This was no social call. This was a meeting of significance. Elias watched them approach the front door. The stocky man knocked, a single sharp rap that cut through the silence. The door opened almost instantly, and for the first time, Elias saw Elara Latham clearly. She was a small, drawn woman, her face a mask of weary composure, her hair pulled back severely. She held a shawl tightly around her thin shoulders. "Mr. Harrison," Elara greeted the man, her voice thin and strangely devoid of warmth. "Silas is at the mill, an urgent matter. He should return within the hour." "The hour will suffice, Mrs. Latham," Mr. Harrison replied, his tone smooth, professional, and slightly menacing. "The terms of the arrangement are fixed, and my client requires this quarterly deposit now. We do not extend credit." Arrangement, deposit. The words clicked immediately in Elias's mind. This wasn't about the mill. This was about the illegal business Silas Latham was running, likely the moonshining that thrived in the mountains, but perhaps something else. The briefcase, the professional menace, it smelled of organized crime, of city connections that reached into the Appalachian hollows. Elara hesitated, glancing nervously toward the dark side of the house, where the smokehouse lay hidden. "Very well, come inside." They entered the house. Elias used the moment to his advantage. He crept across the yard to the front porch, flattened himself against the stone foundation, and pressed his ear to the wooden wall just beneath the parlor window. He heard the faint sounds of chairs scraping and the rustle of paper. The agreed sum, Harrison's voice, crisp and businesslike, and the update on the inventory. Elara's voice, a hesitant whisper. "The inventory is stable. They require more sustenance. It is becoming difficult to manage their consumption while maintaining the necessary appearance." Inventory. The word struck Elias like a physical blow. They weren't talking about grain or liquor. They were talking about the children. They were treating human lives as commodities. "My client is not interested in your operational difficulties, Mrs. Latham," Harrison said, his voice hardening. "He is interested in the delivery schedule and the quality. The last batch was substandard, too weak. You must remember the ultimate purpose of this inventory. Their strength is paramount." Elias's blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over him. Ultimate purpose. What could be worse than confinement? He pressed harder against the rough wood, desperate to hear more. Elara sighed, a sound of deep, profound weariness. "The new process is taxing on them, Mr. Harrison, especially the psychological conditioning. Silas maintains that the children must remain broken, but docile. It's the isolation that does the true work. Psychological conditioning, broken, but docile." Elias realized the horror was deeper and more systematic than simple captivity. The Lathams were refining their cruelty for a client, a black market. Suddenly, a door creaked open inside the house, and footsteps, heavy, masculine, came down a hallway toward the parlor. "Speak of the devil," Harrison murmured. "Silas is back." Elias pulled back instantly. Silas had returned early. The mill repair must have been simpler than anticipated, or perhaps he'd simply decided the mill could wait. Elias had to get back to Clara and the children. If Silas found them missing, he would lock down the property and hunt them like animals. But as Elias turned to leave, he heard Silas Latham's voice, chillingly normal, cutting through the house's quiet. "Mr. Harrison, my apologies. The mill can wait. I have the records right here." A moment of silence, then Silas's voice, closer to the window, took on a low, menacing tone. "But before we discuss the figures, I have a question. Did you happen to see anyone lingering near the North Woods Road? An unfamiliar vehicle, perhaps? I feel a disturbance in the air, a scent of interference." Elias froze, barely daring to breathe. Silas Latham's suspicion had been instantly triggered. Elias had been too close. He was now a silent, terrified witness, trapped on the front porch of a man who dealt in human bondage. He had to vanish, and fast, without revealing the children's escape. Elias knew he was moments from being discovered. Silas Latham was standing near the parlor window. His senses, sharpened by years of illegal activity and mountain life, already tuned to danger. Elias pressed his body flat against the ground under the porch, his back against the cold, damp stone foundation. The space was tight, filled with dust and cobwebs, offering barely a foot of clearance. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of Silas Latham passed directly above him, moving from the parlor to the front door. The door creaked open. Silas was now standing on the porch, his shadow stretching over Elias. "I heard no one, Silas," Mr. Harrison called from inside. "Only your truck's loud departure and return. You are too suspicious, man. It's the nature of our business." Silas's voice was a low growl. "Suspicion keeps one alive in these hollows, Harrison. I smell an outsider. A clean city scent, like cheap soap and good leather. Not the smell of these mountains." Elias forced himself to regulate his breathing, swallowing the thick dust. He heard Silas walk to the edge of the porch, his feet creaking on the worn wood planks right over Elias's head. Silas was scanning the property, his eyes searching the surrounding woods. "Perhaps you should focus on your inventory, Silas," Harrison prompted, irritation creeping into his tone. "The market for this sort of conditioning is unique and highly sensitive to delays. My client expects the highest quality." Silas grunted, a sound of deep, simmering contempt. He took one last, slow turn, then returned to the parlor, allowing Elias a sliver of relief. "It's simply the isolation, Harrison. It plays tricks on the mind," Silas said, closing the front door with a deliberate thud. Elias waited 3 full minutes, the tension a heavy weight on his chest. He knew he had to get out now, while the Lathams and Harrison were distracted by their grotesque business transaction. He began to crawl backward, slowly, deliberately, silently. He moved 20 feet on his stomach until he reached the relative cover of the overgrown rose bushes by the corner of the house. He stood up, his clothes dusted and soiled, and broke into a silent, desperate run toward the smokehouse. He reached the smokehouse, his heart pounding. He checked the wooden panel. It was secure, exactly as he had left it. The lie was holding. He kept running, taking the winding logging trail until he reached the pre-arranged meeting spot near the creek bed. Clara was waiting, crouched in the thicket, the children silent and huddled beneath the canvas tarp in the wagon. "Silas is back," Elias gasped, bent over, hands on his knees, struggling for air. He saw nothing, but he suspected interference. "And Clara, I found out more. They're not just holding them, they call them inventory. They're conditioning them for an outside client, for a dark market." Clara covered her mouth, her eyes wide with a pure, gut-wrenching horror. God in heaven, the psychological work. What does that even mean? It means the children are assets, products, and the Lathams are professionals, Elias said, standing up, his face grim. "We have to move. Now. We can't take the wagon on the main road. We follow the creek for 2 miles, through the woods, until we hit the old firebreak trail. It's rough, but it's hidden. I need you to lead, Clara. You know these trails better than I do." Clara immediately took the reins of the mule cart, her face set in a look of grim determination. "Get in, Elias. We don't have a second to spare." As Elias climbed onto the wagon, he felt the heavy weight of the children's silence beneath the blankets. They were free, but their escape was not yet secure, and the truth of what they had endured was a darkness that had just begun to surface. The mule started, pulling the wagon through the thicket. The wheels caught on a submerged root, and the wagon lurched violently. A small, dry pop sound was emitted from beneath the canvas. Elias looked back. One of the children had kicked something. He reached under the top and pulled it out. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, a whittled toy of remarkable detail. It was clearly not an object a child in that basement would have made. It was sophisticated, a token of affection, maybe even a tool of comfort given to them. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Something Silas or Elara gave them," Elias replied, turning it over in his hand. "A psychological tool, a sick comfort." He slipped the wooden bird into his pocket, another piece of evidence. They rode on, the darkness of the woods swallowing them, the sound of the creek their only cover. Elias knew that Silas Latham's suspicion would quickly turn into a terrifying, methodical search once he realized his inventory was missing. The children are free, but the Lathams know something is wrong. The chase is on, and the true purpose of their confinement is starting to reveal a terrifying, organized network. Don't miss the descent into the chilling darkness. Make sure you subscribe now and hit the notification bell for the next chapters. The wagon ride through the dense, unforgiving woods was a nightmare of sound and movement. Every snap of a branch, every stumble of the mule, felt like an alarm bell ringing across the silent hollow. Elias and Clara exchanged anxious glances, their hands gripped tight on the wagon frame. The children remained unnervingly silent beneath the top, their years of confinement having bred a passive obedience to the new darkness. After 30 minutes of heart-stopping travel along the winding, water-laced creek, the mule finally reached the old, abandoned fire break, a narrow, barely passable dirt road that climbed steeply up the ridge. "We'll be exposed up here," Elias noted, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges. "But it's the quickest route to the doctor in Laurel Branch." "Laurel Branch is miles away," Clara said, urging the mule onward. "But we have no choice. The children need medical help, and this road avoids the main thoroughfare and the mill." They had traveled less than a quarter mile up the fire break when a distant sound, low and powerful, reached them. The sound of a truck engine strained and laboring up a hill. "Silas," Elias stated flatly. There was no mistaking the sound of Latham's unique, battered vehicle on the rough terrain. Silas had returned from his meeting, checked the basement, and was now in pursuit, methodically searching the only roads out. "He's using the main ridge road," Clara said, her voice tight with panic. "He'll intersect this trail in less than 10 minutes. We can't outrun him, Elias." Elias acted instantly. He jumped off the wagon. "Clara, keep going. Slowly, quietly. Stick to the trail. I'll divert him. I need 5 minutes." He quickly gathered a handful of large stones. He ran 100 yards back down the fire break, just to the point where the trail curved sharply around a thick stand of rhododendrons. He took the small, distinctive leather shoe he had found in the basement and placed it deliberately in the center of the trail, where it would be clearly visible. Then he began to throw the stones with all his strength, aiming for the dense trees and rocks on the opposite side of the creek from their own escape path. He timed the throws to mimic the sound of frantic, desperate running through thick brush. Thwack, crunch, rattle. He heard the truck grind to a halt on the ridge road above. The engine cut out. Silence. Then Silas Latham's voice, sharp and cold, cutting through the forest. "I see you. Don't you dare go near the water." Elias waited for the sound of the truck door slamming. He threw one final heavy stone, deeper into the woods, then plunged into the brush himself, running parallel to the fire break, keeping his distance, moving like a ghost. He was the distraction. He was the bait. He heard the heavy, purposeful footsteps of Silas Latham crashing through the brush on the opposite side of the creek. Silas wasn't aiming for the firebreak. He was following the noise, believing the children, or one of them, had run away from the road and toward the dangerous creek bank, a familiar fear used for decades to keep mountain children in line. Elias ran for several minutes, the pounding of his heart almost drowning out the sounds of Silas's blind pursuit. He had successfully diverted the monster. He stopped, utterly winded, and listened. He heard Silas still crashing through the trees, cursing under his breath. Elias took a slow, circuitous route back to the firebreak. He found Clara and the wagon waiting a half-mile up the trail, hidden again in a small pocket of evergreens. "He's chasing the phantom runner," Elias whispered, climbing back onto the wagon. "He'll figure it out soon enough. He's looking for one child, Clara. He'll find the shoe, and his suspicion will shift from runaway to interference." Clara's face was wet with tears, but her eyes held steel. "We have to keep moving. If he suspects outside help, he'll look for the other evidence, the broken chains, the panel." "I secured the panel," Elias assured her. "But the chains, they are our evidence and his ultimate undoing. The children are the priority. We get them safe and we use the full power of the law and that city connection to bring him down." They pushed onward. The sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of purple and bruised orange that mocked the darkness they carried with them. They traveled through the full night, taking turns driving the exhausted mule, the small, frail bodies of the children, a precious, silent cargo beneath the blankets. Just before dawn, they reached the outskirts of Laurel Branch. It was a slightly larger, less isolated community than Black Creek, with a small, reputable clinic run by a retired Navy doctor. "Take them to Dr. Evans," Elias instructed, pulling the mule to a stop behind the clinic. "Tell him nothing of the Lathams, only that you found them abandoned. Tell him they need treatment for severe malnourishment and shock. Tell him I'm a deputy sheriff and I'll be back with the full weight of the warrant." Clara gave him a look of deep respect and gratitude. "And you, Elias?" "I have to go back," he said, pulling the wooden bird and the sketch from his pocket. "I need the chains, and I need to find out what psychological conditioning means, and why there was a sixth shoe." Elias turned, not toward the sunrise, but back toward the dark, menacing hollow of the Smoky Mountains. He was no longer just a lawman. He was a hunter. He had the children safe, but the truth, the core of the Latham family's horror, was still waiting to be unearthed. He knew Silas would be waiting too. His suspicion now turned to icy, methodical rage. Elias Thorne re-entered Black Creek hours later, moving on foot, exhausted but driven by a cold, righteous fury. The sun was high and the village seemed unnaturally quiet, a premonition of a coming storm. He avoided the main road, circling through the deep woods until he reached the Latham property. The place was a hive of quiet activity. Silas Latham's truck was parked haphazardly. He was gone, but another vehicle was there. A heavy enclosed black van, the kind used for deliveries or transport, parked near the barn. The black van, the client's transport. Silas hadn't just discovered the escape. He had called in his associates. Elias needed to get back into the smokehouse basement, secure the chains, and search for any clue about the sixth child before the evidence was removed or destroyed. He crept to the smokehouse. The outer panel was still secured by the wooden beam. He opened it and slipped into the darkness of the cellar. The metallic smell was stronger, now laced with a powerful odor of pine resin and ammonia. Silas had tried to clean up. Elias pulled out his lamp. The iron rings were still bolted to the wall, but the chains had been cut. The links lay scattered on the dirt floor, thick, damning evidence of confinement. Elias quickly gathered them, shoving the heavy, cold metal into a canvas bag. He then moved to the corner where he had found the small leather shoe. He began to scrape away the dirt and old straw, searching for anything missed. He found it. A rectangular depression in the earth, much shallower than the children's sleeping hollows. He dug with his small trowel and quickly hit wood. It was a small, crudely built wooden chest, no larger than a shoebox, entirely forgotten by the frantic Silas. Elias pried the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss, was a small, rolled-up oilskin packet, tied with string. He carefully opened the packet. Inside were 3 items. 1. A single yellowed photograph. A picture of a small, smiling girl, perhaps 6 years old, wearing the exact leather shoe Elias had found. She had bright, clear eyes, and she was clearly not one of the 5 children he had rescued, nor did she look like a Latham child. 2. A small, handwritten diary, bound in leather. 3. A lock of braided auburn hair, tied with a simple, clean ribbon. Elias opened the diary. The handwriting was neat, adult, and consistent, written in dated, methodical entries. He recognized the tone instantly. It was the voice of Alara Latham. The first entry, dated 4 years prior, 2 years before the disappearances began, read, September 12th, 1915. Silas insists the basement room is ready. It must be maintained. The first guest must be perfect. He says conditioning starts with the mother. If the client wants the purest fear, the first must be broken entirely. The next entries documented a single year of psychological torture, forced isolation, starvation, sensory deprivation, and a horrifying process Silas called re-education. The entries confirmed that the Latham's first victim was not a stranger, but Ilara's niece, the girl in the photograph, the one whose shoe was found. Alara wrote with a detached clinical horror, describing her husband's cruelty, her own complicity, and the terrible effectiveness of the isolation. The final entry about the niece was dated 1 year after the first, September 15th, 1916. The conditioning is complete. The client took her today. Silas received a large sum. The girl was silent, vacant, utterly without will. Silas says this is the prototype. She is no longer her mother's daughter. She is a commodity. We will continue the process, starting with the next round of vulnerable children. Elias felt a surge of ice-cold shock. The 5 children he rescued were the second round. The little girl in the photo, the niece, was the 6th child, the one Silas had perfected his horrific technique on. The inventory was a long-term, established and profitable business. The braided hair was hers, a sick trophy of a life destroyed. He had just stumbled onto the truth of Silas Latham's true, hidden crime, the calculated psychological destruction of children for sale on a specialized black market. Elias carefully placed the diary, the photo, and the braided hair into the canvas bag with the chains. He now had irrefutable evidence. He secured the panel one last time and slipped back out into the woods. He heard the creak of the barn door. A figure emerged. Mr. Harrison, the city man, walking toward the black van, carrying a large rolled-up object, likely a new, sturdier chain, or a supply of their grotesque comfort objects. Elias had his evidence, but he couldn't leave yet. He had to know the connection. He had to know who Harrison's client was. Elias crept closer, positioning himself behind a thick stack of chopped wood near the barn. Harrison opened the back of the black van. The interior was dark, but Elias caught a brief glimpse of the contents. Crates, straw, and something else, metal cages, the kind used for large animals, empty and spotless. Harrison tossed the rolled object inside the van and paused, pulling a small silver flask from his coat. He took a long, deep drink of liquor, a valuable, illegal commodity in 1919, and let out a satisfied sigh. Then, Harrison pulled a small, engraved business card from his wallet and, with a flick of his wrist, tossed it onto the driver's seat. Elias read the gold-embossed lettering in the sunlight. The Nightingale Institute, Private Sanatorium, Asheville. Elias's mind reeled. A private sanatorium. Not a distant criminal ring, but a respectable-looking institute in the city, using the Lathams to procure, condition, and deliver psychologically broken children. The truth was far worse than he imagined. This was institutionalized, calculated evil, masked by wealth and medical legitimacy. A door slammed in the main house. Silas Latham was coming out. Elias grabbed the bag and bolted, running in a silent, desperate flight back toward the firebreak. He was no longer running from a simple mountain monster, but from a conspiracy of immense, terrifying scale. Elias ran until his lungs burned, and the roar of his own panic drowned out the sounds of the mountain. He reached the old firebreak, finally slowing to a fast, stumbling walk. He held the canvas bag tight, its contents, the chains and the diary, a heavy, cold assurance of the truth. He didn't make it far before he heard the new sound, a horse and buggy moving fast. He crouched behind a boulder, drawing his revolver. It wasn't the black van, but Clara Bell. She had driven to Laurel Branch, secured the children, and immediately returned, knowing Elias would need help or rescue. Elias, thank God! Clara pulled the buggy to an abrupt stop. Her eyes were wide with a fierce, terrified urgency. I delivered the children. Dr. Evans is treating them, but he's suspicious. I need to get you out. Elias scrambled into the buggy. We have to move. It's the Nightingale Institute, Clara, a private sanatorium in Asheville. They're the buyers. They're using the Lathams to condition children, psychologically break them, for a market. And I have the chains, the diary of Elara Latham, and the buyer's card. Clara listened in stunned, horrified silence, her face growing paler with every word. The Nightingale. I know the name. Old, wealthy clientele. They deal in specialized medical care, they say. Specialized horror, Clara. Silas Latham has powerful protection. The police force in Asheville is likely compromised by this institute. Oh, we can't go to the local authorities. They rode hard for the rest of the morning, avoiding the main roads, Clara navigating the hidden mountain trails with an intuitive ease that saved their lives. They had to get the evidence to a federal authority, someone outside the direct reach of Asheville. They reached a small, isolated telegraph office near the state line in the late afternoon. Elias, after a tense, coded exchange, arranged to meet a trusted contact, a federal investigator based in Knoxville, early the next morning. The next day, Elias and Clara met the investigator. Elias laid out the chains, the drawing, the shoe, and the small, leather-bound diary, its entries a horrifying blueprint for psychological destruction. The federal agent, a stoic man who had seen much, looked at the evidence and the sheer, calculated evil it represented, his face hardening into granite. Within 48 hours, the federal sweep began. The initial target was not the Latham farm, but the Nightingale Institute in Asheville, catching the organization at the top of the chain. Records were seized, high-profile arrests were made, doctors, administrators, and wealthy individuals named in the Institute's files, all clients in the market for docile, compliant subjects. The exposure was a scandal that rocked the region, a dark secret of the wealthy elite brought into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Finally, the focus shifted to Black Creek. When the federal marshals arrived at the Latham farm, they found the black van and Mr. Harrison gone. Silas and Elara Latham were in the main house. Silas did not fight. He was found sitting in the parlor, staring out the window toward the silent smokehouse, his face a mask of dull, defeated fury. Elara was found in the kitchen, silently washing a dinner plate. They were arrested, their silence an unnerving testament to their psychological detachment. The true resolution, however, lay with the children. The 5 victims, severely traumatized and malnourished, were placed in long-term specialized care, slowly beginning the arduous process of healing. Their recovery would be long and difficult, marked by the psychological scars of their long confinement. The name of the 6th child, the niece, was also added to the case, now a victim whose life was brutally stolen by the very man meant to protect her. Elias Thorne, hailed by the press as a quiet hero, refused the accolades. He knew the arrests were only the beginning. The evil that lurked in the isolation of the mountains and the sickness that thrived in the city's institutions was too deep to be erased by a single investigation. A few months later, Elias met Clara Bell one last time in Asheville. She was preparing to leave the Smoky Mountains, having finally given her statement to the grand jury. The Lathams will hang Elias, and the men at the Institute will go to prison, Clara said, her voice hollow. But the children, They are a silence that will never truly be broken. Elias nodded, looking at the city around them, the respectable facades of wealth hiding the darkness he had uncovered. He carried the scars of the Hollow, the memory of the children's eyes, and the final, chilling entry from Ilara's diary. The easy acceptance of a child becoming a commodity. "They may be banned from history books, Clara," Elias said, gripping the wooden bird he still carried in his pocket. "But they will never be forgotten by us. That is the only justice left." Elias chose to resign from his post, the trauma of the case too deep, the realization of the surrounding evil too profound. He walked away from law enforcement, a man who had seen the absolute limit of human cruelty, leaving the silence of the mountains, but carrying the heavy, haunting whispers of Black Creek with him forever.